Hello, health champions. I really hope you haven't bought into all the lies about fat. I was speechless when I came across this list about the types of fat that a lot of people believe are either very or somewhat healthy. So omega-3s, 86% of people thought they were healthy. Soybean oil, 81% of people thought they were healthy. Polyunsaturated fats, 43%. Monounsaturated fats, 42%. 32% of people thought hydrogenated fats were healthy. Trans fats, 22%. And saturated fat, 21%. For some of these, it's pretty clear cut. They're just plain bad. But for a lot of them, it's going to depend. It's going to depend on the quality, it's going to depend on the circumstance, and what type. What is actually an omega-3? Soybean oil, there's nothing really good about it. Polyunsaturated, it depends. Monounsaturated, it depends. With hydrogenated oils and trans fats, there's nothing good about it. And with saturated fat, it's going to depend. The first lie I want to set straight is the belief that fat makes you fat. And the belief that you're fat because your intake exceeds your expenditure. You eat more than you burn. Now, this part is actually true. The part where people get off track is when they start counting calories and thinking that this is the same thing, that if you eat more calories than you burn, then you will get fat. And the reason they think fat makes you fat is that fat has more calories. It has 9 calories per gram versus 4 calories for protein or carbohydrate. But if you believe it's all about calories in and calories out, I just have one question for you. Are you a bomb calorimeter? And what's that, you ask? Well, here's a bomb calorimeter. That is a closed system that they use to burn things and then measure heat as a result of that burning, of that combustion. So they put a little thing in here, they set fire to it, and they measure how much warmer does the water get. So it's kind of like in your car. If you have a gasoline car, then you're exploding, you're combusting gasoline inside a closed environment, and you get heat and energy in exchange. So if you looked yourself in the mirror recently, when you woke up and you saw this, then you could be a bomb calorimeter. And then it's probably a good idea for you to worry only about calories. That's probably the only variable that would concern you. However, if you didn't look like this, if you looked more like a human, then you have completely different variables because you make energy differently. You make them with enzymes and receptors and cofactors and hormones. And you don't have enzymes and cofactors and hormones that process calories. You have them to process molecules with certain shapes and certain fits. And that's how you break down food and turn it into energy, not as heat. You make something called ATP. And whenever you eat a little more than you need right in this moment, which we always do because you eat for this moment and for a few hours after, then there is a hormone called insulin that is responsible for taking the extra and storing it away. And some of it stores as carbohydrate, but whatever it can't store as carbohydrate, because we have very limited room to store carbohydrate, the rest gets turned into fat. And that's called lipogenesis. And insulin is a hormone that promotes turning carbohydrate into fat and storing it. So it promotes lipogenesis. But it also works the other way in that it prevents breaking down. So when we have high levels of insulin, then the fat that we stored previously, we have less access to it. It's not as readily available to us to make energy. Now, if we're metabolically healthy, then insulin rises to store it and insulin falls so that we can retrieve it. But if we are insulin resistant, if we have made a lot of insulin for a long time, now insulin is high to store it, but then it stays high so we can't retrieve it. And therefore, chronically high levels of insulin and insulin resistant promotes hunger. It increases hunger. So therefore, insulin and insulin resistance promotes overeating. So it is absolutely true that if you are overweight, you overate. But the question is, why did that happen? It's not because you were gluttonous and slothful and had poor character. It's because you ate the wrong thing that unbalanced your system and created insulin resistance. And now that insulin causes you to continue overeating. So the trick is to bring this insulin down. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, we have to understand what types of food promote insulin. And just as a very simple explanation, we could say that carbs would create this much insulin. If we put a number on it, it would be like 100. If we have protein, then it would create this much, and we could say that it would be like teens. And when we eat fat, that fat does not raise blood sugar, so we're talking an arrow that much, and we're talking single digits, like 1 to 4, basically. So the fallacy that fat makes you fat completely ignores the mechanism that humans use to break down and store energy. So carbohydrate is by far the greatest contributor to insulin and insulin resistance. And that's what we need to cut back on if we want to lose that weight. One of the most popular oils recently is monounsaturated fatty acids. And 42% of people thought that that was a good idea. It is very prevalent in olive oil. And olive oil has a lot of monounsaturated, but it also has a lot of saturated or some saturated and some polyunsaturated. So if we look at the monounsaturated, 74%, so about 3/4 would be monounsaturated. 15% though is still saturated, and about 10% is polyunsaturated. But we're going to compare this olive oil to two other things, and this is going to be a shock to a lot of people. Beef actually has 42% monounsaturated fat in it. And it has 50% saturated and 4% polyunsaturated. Now, we hear all the time that we should eat plant-based oils like olive oil as if they were all the same. Well, soybean oil, which is by far the most consumed oil in the United States, only has 23% monounsaturated fats. It has 15% saturated and 57% polyunsaturated fats. So if we look at this, now we see that beef is actually much closer in character to olive oil, with a relatively high monounsaturated and very low polyunsaturated, than what soybean oil is to olive oil. Now think about this for a second. One of the reasons the olive oil is so popular is that people around the Mediterranean, like Crete and Greece and Italy, eat tons and tons of olive oil, and they have very little heart disease. In the US, however, we eat almost all soybean oil. So in the US, we eat about 35 to 40 liters of soybean oil per person and about half to 1 liter of olive oil, and we have tons of heart disease and metabolic disease. In Greece, they do the opposite. They have about 30 to 35 liters of olive oil and virtually no soybean oil. And yet we keep hearing that polyunsaturated fats are so good for us, that we should limit fat, but the fat that we do eat should be polyunsaturated, that it's so much better for us. Don't believe that lie. Have you ever wondered why fats are solid or liquid? Well, we're going to talk about that, and I'm going to give you a little bit of detail, but no more than what you need to really get this. And it's super interesting because it's all about the shape that gives the fat their different properties. So a saturated fatty acid starts off with a chain of carbons, and most fats are going to have 16 to 18 carbons in the chain. I'm only drawing 5 here to save space and give you better detail. At the end, we have a molecule that makes it a fatty acid, and we'll just call that X because it's not important. And then for each carbon, we attach 2 hydrogens. And when we have hydrogens all the way around, now this makes it saturated. The carbon chain is saturated with hydrogens. There is no more room to add any more because the carbon can bind 4 different molecules. It can bind 4 ways. And now we have 4 things bound to each carbon. It's saturated. So this makes it straight because these hydrogens, they take up space, but because they take equal space symmetrically, then they're going to push each other apart and we end up with a straight molecule. Straight molecules are going to pack much tighter. They're going to move less, and that makes the fat solid. But also, it's going to make it stable. Because it's full of hydrogen, it doesn't have much of a tendency, very low tendency to react with anything else. It can't change much. It can't take on any more molecules. And that makes saturated fats very non-reactive. That means that they're going to last for a long time. They don't oxidize very easily, and you can keep them in room temperature for quite a long time. And then we have monounsaturated fatty acids like olive oil. And again, we start with a portion of a straight chain, and in real life, it's going to be a total of 16 to 18 carbons. On the straight part, we're going to have hydrogens attached on both sides, but then there's a place that's different. And this is where on between 2 carbons, we're going to have a double bond instead of a single bond. So there's 2 links, and carbon can only bind 4 ways, and now it's using up 2 in one place. So that means we only have room for 1 more hydrogen on each carbon. And because these carbons take up space and they're unopposed by anything on the other side, they're going to push each other apart. They're going to be allowed to take more room, and we get a bent chain. We get a kink in the molecule. And because of this kink, it's going to not pack as tight as a saturated fat. So that's why olive oil is liquid at room temperature. But if you get into refrigerated or very cool temperatures, you can see that olive oil starting to harden a little bit. And even though it doesn't pack, this molecule doesn't pack as tightly together as saturated fat, it's still considered stable because you can keep it on the counter for months and it doesn't need any refrigeration. And the next one is going to be polyunsaturated. Poly means more than 1. So again, a portion of it's going to be straight, but now we have more than 1 double bond. So now we're going to have more places that have room for hydrogen. We're going to have more places where the hydrogen is on one side of the molecule only. And again, in real life, this is going to have 16 to 18 carbons. So there's going to be more hydrogens. There's going to be some straight portions. But I'm just showing you this to keep it simple, that we have more kinks, more bends, and the molecule is going to pack less tightly. So the more of these double bonds we have, the more unsaturated it is, the more liquid it is. And now because it is so bent, it's going to be liquid in the refrigerator. And some of these, when you have 3 or 4 or 5 double bonds, they're going to be liquid even in the freezer. And what we really need to understand about these fats, the polyunsaturated, is that now they are unstable and highly reactive because there's so many places that are unsaturated, so many places that have room for something to react, then they're going to be very prone to react and get oxidized. And that's why these oils need refrigeration, especially if there's some quality. We'll talk about the highly processed ones. And if you have something like cod liver oil, then you absolutely want to store it in the fridge or even in the freezer because it's going to be liquid even in the freezer. So you could open it, keep it in the freezer, and take a little sip now and then. And then there's something called trans fat that most people today realize are really, really bad, even though we had 30% of people thought it was a good idea in that survey. But we start with a liquid oil. We start with a carbon chain, 16 to 18 carbons. But the whole point of the process that creates trans fats is to turn a liquid into a solid. So what they do is now they bombard. This chain is already going to have some hydrogens on it, but now they have a cannon that they bombard this. They shoot additional hydrogen on it under heat and pressure. And now some of these hydrogens are going to end up on opposite sides, and we're going to have some of these double bonds remain. That's called partially hydrogenated. That's why you want to look at the label. If it says partially hydrogenated, then you know you're going to have some of these molecules. And when the hydrogens end up on opposite sides, that's called a trans fat. Again, in nature, these would be on the same side, and it would be like oleic acid in olive oil, and you would have a bent molecule. But here the whole purpose was to take a liquid and basically straighten the molecule, hydrogenate it so it turns straight. And now we have a plant fat that used to be liquid, but now it's straight, and these pack together, and we have made margarine. We start with a liquid, and now that it's solid, we have made it more shelf stable. And that's why these fats are so popular in processed foods, because they're dirt cheap and they can sit on the shelf forever almost. And the main thing to understand about this molecule is that it's unnatural. It never existed on the planet until humans started making it. That exact configuration is man-made, and therefore it doesn't fit inside living beings. And I don't care what anybody says. We don't need 50 years of research to figure that out. If it's a man-made molecule that never existed before, then chances are overwhelmingly high that it will cause trouble, that it will not have a natural place in our bodies. And sure enough, this oil turned into margarine and was promoted as super healthy plant fats. Everyone should use it, of course, until they turned out that it promoted non-alcoholic fatty liver, that it caused increased inflammation, that it is very strongly linked to heart disease. But then there is one type of trans fat that's natural. It's called CLA, or conjugated linoleic acid. Now, the thing is, though, that it doesn't look exactly like this, because if the hydrogens are on different number carbons, if it's on number 9 instead of 11, then it's a different fat. And those fats are actually super healthy. So the CLAs are produced primarily naturally in cows, and they have done studies where when they use the natural trans fat in the form of a CLA, it does the opposite of the man-made trans fat. Then it actually reverses fatty liver, it promotes fat burning, it reduces inflammation. So that's why I'm going through these details, so that you understand that it makes all the difference if the hydrogen is on a different number carbon. If we move it from 11 to 12, it becomes a different molecule, and it has a different function, and it's like a puzzle piece that fits differently in our biochemistry. And now that you have those basics, I need to show you what omega-3s and omega-6s are. So here are the fatty acids that we talked about. And if they have one double bond, it's monounsaturated. If it has more than one, at least two, then it's called polyunsaturated. So we have the X, the fatty acid end-terminal group on one end, and then we have 16 to 18 carbons. And we start counting from the other end. So we start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and up. And in oleic acid, in olive oil, now we have the double bond on the 9th carbon. If we have an omega-6, it is on the 6th carbon, And you guessed it, if we have an omega-3, now it's going to be on the third carbon. And now it gets really interesting when we talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids and omega-3s. So 42% of people thought that polyunsaturated fatty acids were healthy, and 86% thought omega-3s were very healthy. And they're often talked about in the same context as if they were the same thing. Even in research, I found this on PubMed, and they say that omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids such as EPA and DHA are essential ... And they went on to talk about how DHA has been very promising in treating and helping people with depression and anxiety and for brain health in general. But the point here is that they say omega-3s polyunsaturated such as. And then people think that omega-3s and polyunsaturated are the same thing, and we're told to eat polyunsaturated vegetable oils. So let's clarify this with an example, and we'll look at soybean oil, which 81% of people think is healthy and is the most sold and consumed oil in the United States. It has 57% polyunsaturated fatty acids, and there's two kinds of those. There's an omega-6 called linoleic acid. That's 50% of that oil. And then there is an omega-3 called alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA, which is 7%. But in the quote we just talked about, they talked about EPA and DHA as kind of the active components. That's like the end result that the body is looking for. And that's where 86% of people believe that's healthy, and they have good reason for that because they're very, very good. They're very beneficial for the body in so many ways. But how much of those precious essential fatty acids are in soybean oil? Well, exactly 0.000%. There is none in there. Now, even though there is exactly 0 of these EPA and DHA in soybean oil, the alpha-linolenic acid can theoretically be turned into EPA and DHA. The problem is that the conversion is very poor. To start with, it's only a few percent of this that can become the EPA and DHA, and the conversion is further reduced by things like sugar and insulin resistance and inflammation and stress and so forth. So in most people, there is virtually no conversion. And the percentage, there's a small percentage that can turn into EPA and a much smaller percentage that becomes DHA. So now we go back to this statement that we started with, and it kind of sort of looks like the PUFA, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, would be the same thing as EPA and DHA, but now we see that they create an association, and people are confused, and we're told to eat polyunsaturated fatty acids because EPA and DHA are supposed to be good, but there's really none in there. Instead, what we're getting with these plant oils is we're getting way too much. Even though this omega-6 is actually essential, that we have to have a little bit, we need tiny, tiny, tiny amounts. And this ratio should ideally be about 1:1. That's how the body best balances inflammation. And it's not that one is bad and the other is good. It's just that when they're way out of balance, then we shift the inflammatory ratio in the body and we tend to promote more inflammation. And with modern diets, this ratio could be as high as a 20:1, whereas if you eat things like grass-fed beef and grass-fed butter, it is more of a 1:1. So polyunsaturated just means more than one. So the linoleic acid has 2 double bonds, the ALA has 3, the EPA has 5. So EPA again is eicosapentaenoic acid, and the P, penta, means 5, and the H, hexa, means 6. So the longer these get, the more convoluted, the more bent they are, the less flat they pack together. And this is why this cod liver oil and fish oil will stay liquid even in the freezer. And I'm sure the fish were pretty clever to do that, to figure that out, because when they swim around in freezing water, they don't want to stiffen up just because they have monounsaturated fats in their body. They want to have the very, very liquid fats. And that's where we get most of these from cold water fish. So what's so great about EPA and DHA? Well, this is just a very short list of benefits. Both EPA and DHA are very prevalent in our cell membranes. You have 37 trillion cells in your body, and the cell membrane is called a bilipid cell membrane. It has 2 layers of fats, and EPA and DHA make up a good component, and they give these cell membranes some of their properties, especially in the nervous system. EPA has been shown to support cardiovascular health. It acts as precursors for signaling molecules. It has anti-inflammatory properties. They've done studies where they measure something called C-reactive protein, which is a general inflammation marker in the body. And by taking EPA, you can lower this inflammation marker. And in some studies, they found that EPA works better than DHA for this. And this is why EPA is generally associated with cardiovascular health and general inflammation, whereas DHA has some other properties. And EPA has also been shown to help the immune system balance out with immune modulation. And if you have some of these things and you'd like to try to maybe supplement with some fish oil, cod liver oil is great. Another one would be Super Omega that we use a lot in our office. It's a pretty concentrated version where you get about a 3:2 of EPA to DHA. And I'll put a link down below if you like. And then there's DHA, docosahexaenoic. That's the longest chain with the most double bonds. And it is critical for brain development. Your brain cannot mature and develop without sufficient quantities. So keep in mind, the brain is actually 60% fat. And out of all that fat, 1/4 is DHA. Only that little thing, this very, very specific fatty acid that we need, just some milligrams, a couple of 500 milligrams a day or so, makes up so much of the brain. And there's an even higher percentage in the retina. In the back of the eye, those photosensing molecules, receptor sensors that help you see, 50% of that retina is DHA. So this is why they talk so much about DHA during pregnancy, because if the mother doesn't have enough DHA, then the nervous system and the retina of that baby will not have enough raw materials to develop properly. And DHA has been very promising in mood regulation, so for people with anxiety, depression, panic attacks. And most of those develop because the brain isn't working properly. The brain isn't strong enough. It's like a light bulb that's gone a little dim. And if you provide the most important building material in the brain, then it's going to work better and be able to balance those factors better. It's also been shown to reduce cognitive decline, so dementia. People stay sharper longer with the right types of fats. And for this particular application, the DHA has been shown to work better, more so than the EPA. So that's where EPA is considered the general inflammation and DHA is kind of considered the brain support. DHA is also important for skin hydration. So the skin has cell membranes just like every other cell in the body, and these molecules, EPA and DHA, are very prevalent there. So if you have some anxiety or some mood disorders, or if you have a kid with hyperactivity, then one of the first things to try before you went to any other medication or pills or anything like that would simply be a good solid dose of DHA. And the one that I use the most in the clinic, because it's very inexpensive for what you get, is called Tuna Omega. I'll put a link down below. And it has a 5-to-1 ratio of DHA to EPA. Most fish oil is the other way around to some ratio, but this one is mostly DHA. So EPA and DHA are very specific examples of polyunsaturated fatty acids. But what's true for all polyunsaturated acids is that they are highly sensitive. They're very reactive. They're just waiting to interact with something like oxygen. So they oxidize very easily, and when they do, they produce free radicals that create inflammation and damage in the body. So when you have a rancid polyunsaturated fatty acid like ALA or EPA or DHA, because they're so reactive, they go rancid very quickly. If you leave them in room temperature, they're going to start stinking really, really bad really quickly. So if you have fresh fish and you don't get it on ice right away, it's going to start stinking within hours to days. And it's because these polyunsaturated fatty acids are so sensitive to oxygen. They react so easy. But then you might wonder, if they smell bad, if they stink, then why do other polyunsaturated fatty acids like soybean oil and all these other vegetable oils, why don't they stink? And it's because they have changed them. They have manipulated them. And after they heat them under pressure and they extract them and they have chemical solvents to extract every little bit of fat out of there, now they get filtered, they get bleached, they get degummed and deodorized. So these oils that they're promoting, that they're telling us to eat, the soybean, the corn, the canola, have been so harshly processed, so they have basically nothing in common with the food that they originally came from. So even though EPA and DHA are very beneficial and a very specific type of polyunsaturated fatty acid, it does not mean that there are other polyunsaturated that are automatically good that we should consume and turn into energy, because they've gone through all of this and they're not good anymore. But how much do we then need of the good stuff, the specific ones that we're looking for? Well, the general recommendation is that if you eat alpha-linolenic acid like flax oil, you need about 1,000 to 1,600 milligrams per day. Typically, it's 1,000 for women and 1,600 for men. And then they say that we also need about 500 milligrams a day combined of EPA and DHA. So that really means that we need to take some fish oil because, like I said, the conversion is so poor that we only get a couple of % at best out of the EPA and the DHA. However, a lot of people who work in the health field, who look for optimal rather than just avoiding deficiencies, they feel that we need somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 milligrams of the EPA and DHA. And the 1,000 is if you're relatively healthy, if you're just maintaining, and there's a good chance that you're converting some of this ALA. But if you're not so healthy, if you're working to reverse some problem, then you probably want to be closer to that 3,000. Now, you probably heard that you get what you pay for. And very often you can go and buy like a 2-pack of huge capsules of fish oil, and they're dirt cheap. And they say that I have 1,200 milligrams of fish oil in them. But then you look at the label, and sometimes they don't even tell you how much EPA and DHA is in there. But one example I found where you had only 240 milligrams of EPA, 120 of DHA, even though you had this huge horse pill of a fish oil capsule, because it's not very concentrated. So a good brand would actually give you just a little bit bigger capsule, or maybe 2 of them, would give you something like 3 to 4 times as much of the good stuff that you're looking for. And most fish oil is going to have more EPA than DHA. If you're looking for the opposite, the one that I mentioned, the tuna omega, would have in 3 capsules, you would get 1,995 milligrams of fish oil, but you get a whole 450 of DHA. And it's not just the absolute amount, but it's the ratio of them. The body tends to process them differently. So if you're looking for the brain support primarily, you want to look for something that has more DHA regardless of the quantity. So when are omega-3s good or bad? Well, if you get them from fresh fish or fresh fish oil, then they're great. If you get them from nuts and seeds that are fresh, then that's good. Just keep in mind that the conversion may not give you what you're looking for in terms of EPA and DHA. And even though the oils are protected in the nuts and seeds, if they're not kept cool, they will go rancid over time. And if they turn into oil, then they go rancid much faster. And now it's actually harmful. And polyunsaturated fatty acids, again, fresh fish oil would be a great source. Nuts and seeds would be a great source. Flaxseed oil would be good if it's fresh, but keep in mind you don't convert all that well if that's what you're looking for. And if you eat the processed plant oils that we're told to consume in mass, then those are not recommended. There's nothing good in there. And if most of the polyunsaturated fatty acids are omega-6s, then you tend to get an excess, which puts you in pro-inflammation, and that's not a good thing. Monounsaturated fatty acids, the best source, the easiest, cheapest, tastiest is extra virgin olive oil. If you can get it organic, that's a plus. And then there is also something called light olive oil, because some people want to use it for dressing or mayonnaise, and they feel like this extra virgin is too strong in flavor, so they sell light versions. But what you have to understand is then they have been filtered, they've removed some of the beneficial things, and they have most likely processed it harder. So extra virgin means it's the first pressing. It's cold pressed, and there is no heat added, and the oil is as little damaged as possible. Whereas when they process it more, now it's not the first squeezing, and they might use some heat and more pressure. So it's not going to have the same beneficial characteristics, and it's not going to have the same nutrients, and it might even be a little bit damaged. So it's not going to be nearly as bad as other oils like soybean or safflower or canola or corn oil. It's going to be ahead of that. Just keep in mind it's not as good as the extra virgin. Same thing with avocado oil. If you get the cold pressed, unfiltered, it's going to be excellent. It's going to be every bit as good as olive oil, but it's again very strong in flavor. It's going to be an intense green color. It's going to be very strong, and almost all of the avocado oil they sell is fairly harshly processed. It's not going to be the cold pressed extra virgin. And it's going to be more like this processed olive oil. Again, it's going to be light years better than the mass market plant oils. So just keep in mind that if you're looking for the purest stuff, then keep it extra virgin unfiltered. And again, surprise to most people is that beef and pork are excellent sources of monounsaturated fats. Chicken, also a good source, not as much as the beef and pork, but still a good source. And the only question is going to be how healthy was the animal, because there's a big difference between a mass-produced chicken and a pastured chicken that led a normal life. Saturated fatty acids like coconut oil are excellent. The butter, better if it's grass-fed and organic, excellent source. Meat is an excellent source. And for all of those, just like before, it's going to depend on the quality. Is it grass-fed? Is it full of hormones and pesticides? How did the animal live? Because the life quality is going to determine the quality of the food. Eggs and dairy are also good sources. And again, the quality of how they were raised, but also we want to keep in mind on these that they're fairly common allergies. So notice how you feel and be a little bit on watch for that as well. So is there anything bad about saturated fat? Well, for most people, there really isn't. As long as you eat a quality food, saturated fat is an excellent source of energy. However, there's always the exception. And if you measure cholesterol the way you should measure, by measuring LDL particle size and count, for some people, the LDL count will increase dramatically on saturated fat and not so much with monounsaturated like olive oil. So you want to measure this and understand it and see what happens for you. For some people, a very small percentage, it becomes a problem, especially if you have a predisposition for making plaque. Then you don't want a very large number of LDL particles. It's one risk factor. Some people can have very large numbers and still be okay, but for some it can be an issue. So the most important thing to understand when we talk about fats being healthy is to understand their purpose in the body. And number one is to act as precursors and building blocks. And number two is to provide energy in this moment and for reserves. And as far as the building blocks, what we're looking for is called EPA and DHA. They're very specialized molecules that fit in cell membranes and that act as precursors. And we need very small amounts. These are not for burning for energy. We need about 1 to 3 grams a day. And the best source to get these is fish. And no matter how many times you're told to eat vegetable oil because it has polyunsaturated fatty acids, that's not the way that you want to get them. When it comes to energy, you want to burn it primarily from stable fats and natural fats. So that's going to be monounsaturated fats, saturated fats, and a small amount of polyunsaturated. So for example, in beef, we have 40 to 45% monounsaturated fatty acid, the good one that's in olive oil. We have 40 to 45% saturated fatty acids, which is an excellent source of energy that you burn for energy. The fat that you eat is not the fat that becomes fat on the body. You convert it. And beef also has about 4% polyunsaturated fatty acids. And some of that is going to be those CLAs, the conjugated linoleic acid that's actually beneficial and reduces inflammation. So this is the fat composition of a cow, of beef fat. Even though the cow only eats grass, or supposed to only eat grass, which is carbohydrate. So the cow has bacteria that breaks down the grass into glucose, and then that glucose turns into this fat composition. So it's not from eating saturated fats. And very similarly in humans, I want to show you a comparison, that humans have a very, very similar 40 to 50% monounsaturated fats that we store, 30 to 40% saturated fats, and I couldn't find any reliable numbers for the polyunsaturated, but it's probably going to be a little bit higher. But regardless, we don't get this fat on the body from eating this fat because the cow didn't. It's just the most efficient, most natural way for us to store energy. And if you think about it, if saturated fat was so bad and you go on a fast, well, now you're eating fat off your body, which is going to be a lot of saturated fat. Is that bad for you? No, of course not. That's just the way we store and use fat. The best forms of fat for energy that you should eat plenty is monounsaturated and saturated fats. They're stable, they're safe, they don't oxidize easily, they burn clean in the body. So the polyunsaturated fats that you eat should be about 1 to 2% of your fat should be EPA and DHA, which is not for energy, and the rest of it, 98, 99%, should be the naturally occurring fats. And the polyunsaturated fats are fine if they're in their natural form, inside nuts and seeds and inside meat. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.